My name is Frank Delgado, and the first night I spent alone in my own house after open-heart surgery, unable to lift a gallon of milk out of my own refrigerator, was also the night I finally understood that my daughter's promises and my daughter's presence had quietly become two very different things. The surgery was a quadruple bypass, 6 hours on a table at Sutter Medical Center, the kind of procedure the surgeon described to me beforehand in a tone that tried very hard to sound routine and mostly succeeded, except for the part where he mentioned the recovery would require someone at home with me for at least the first 2 weeks. My daughter Melissa flew in from Phoenix the day before the surgery, sat in the waiting room the whole 6 hours according to the nurses, and was there when I woke up groggy and disoriented in the recovery unit, her hand over mine, telling me everything had gone well. "I've got you, Dad," she said. "I already told work I'm staying 2 weeks. You're not doing this alone." I believed her. I want to be clear about that, because believing her wasn't foolish, not at that moment. She'd taken time off. She'd made the arrangements. Every sign pointed toward a daughter who intended to keep the promise she'd just made to a man 3 hours out of open-heart surgery. She stayed 4 days. On the 5th morning, I woke up to find her already dressed, a suitcase by the front door, an Uber pulling into the driveway. "Dad, I am so sorry. There's this whole situation at work. They moved up a client presentation, and if I'm not there Monday, it could seriously affect my position. I've set up your pill organizer for the week, I've stocked the fridge, and Mrs. Alvarez next door said she'd check on you. You're going to be fine." I sat in my recliner, still moving like a man twice my age, an incision running down the center of my chest that made even sitting up feel like a negotiation, and I told her it was fine. I told her I understood. I have said those 2 phrases to my daughter so many times over the years that I sometimes wonder whether they've become less of a truth and more of a reflex. A thing I say the way you flinch when something comes at your face too fast. The Uber pulled away. The house went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in 5 days, and I sat there in that recliner, unable to reach the remote control that had slid 6 inches too far across the side table, unable to stand up without pain sharp enough to make my eyes water, listening to my own heartbeat, freshly rewired by a surgeon's hands, tick along in a house that suddenly felt much bigger than it had ever felt with someone else in it. Around 2 that afternoon, there was a knock at my front door. I couldn't get up to answer it. I sat there, frustrated, calling out that I couldn't come to the door, and after a moment, the door opened anyway, because I'd forgotten to lock it after Melissa left. And Dolores Alvarez, my next-door neighbor for the last 11 years, walked in carrying a covered dish and a look of immediate, focused concern. "Frank, Melissa said she was leaving today, but I didn't realize that meant this morning." She set the dish down and crouched beside my chair, studying my face with the practiced eye of a woman who'd spent 30 years as an ICU nurse before retiring 2 years earlier. "You're pale. Have you eaten anything today?" "I was going to," I said, which was true, in the sense that I'd been meaning to for the last 4 hours without ever actually managing the trip to the kitchen. Ruth, as everyone in the neighborhood called her, didn't say anything else about it right then. She simply went into my kitchen, warmed up whatever was in that covered dish, brought it to me with a glass of water and my afternoon pills already sorted into her palm, and sat with me while I ate, checking my incision site with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done this exact task for thousands of patients over a career, except this time doing it for a neighbor, unpaid, unasked, simply because she'd noticed a car pull out of a driveway and understood immediately what that meant for the man left behind in it. I didn't know, sitting in that recliner that afternoon, that Ruth Alvarez was about to become the single most important presence in my recovery, my health, and honestly my whole outlook on what family actually means. But to understand how a retired ICU nurse ended up walking uninvited into my living room that day, and why she stayed there, in one form or another, for the following 2 months, I need to back up considerably further than that Tuesday afternoon. I bought the house on Larkspur Court in 1988, the same year I married my wife Carol, a school teacher with a laugh I fell in love with before I fell in love with anything else about her. We raised our daughter Melissa in that house, a good, ordinary childhood, backyard barbecues, church on Sundays, above-ground pool we saved up 2 years to afford. I worked 34 years for the Postal Service, walked a route in the same neighborhood for most of that career, the kind of job that doesn't make you wealthy but makes you known, recognized, trusted by 3 generations of families along the same 6-block stretch. Hector and Ruth Alvarez moved in next door in 2012, Right around the time, Hector retired from 30 years with the fire department, and Ruth was still working full-time in the ICU at Sutter. Hector and I became close, the particular way retired men become close, mostly over fences, mostly about lawns and ball games, but close enough that when Carol's health started declining 8 years ago, breast cancer that took 14 months to run its course, Hector was one of the few men in my life who showed up consistently, mowing my lawn without being asked during the worst stretches, sitting with me on my porch some evenings when the house felt too quiet to sit in alone. Ruth, working her ICU shifts, wasn't around as much during those months, but I remember her stopping by more than once with meals, the same practiced kindness she'd later show me after my own surgery, offered without any expectation of it ever being returned. Carol passed 6 years ago. Melissa, 26 at the time, flew in for the funeral and stayed a full 2 weeks afterward, helping me sort through Carol's things, sitting with me through the worst of the early grief. I remember thinking, during those 2 weeks, that whatever distance had crept into our relationship over her college years and her early career would finally start closing for good. It didn't, not permanently. Grief closes distance temporarily, the way floodwater rises and then recedes, leaving the ground exactly the way it was before, just wetter for a while. Melissa moved to Phoenix for a marketing job the year after Carol died, and visits became quarterly, then twice a year, then mostly holidays. The same slow erosion that happens in 1,000 families without anyone deciding, at any single moment, that it should happen that way. Hector had a heart attack of his own 3 years ago, sudden, in his own backyard while trimming a hedge, and I was the one who found him, having heard something fall and gone to check over the science line out of pure instinct. I performed CPR until the paramedics arrived, kept it up for 11 minutes according to the timestamp on the 911 call, though it felt considerably longer than that in the moment. Hector didn't survive. The paramedics told Ruth later that the CPR had likely given her the extra time she needed to say goodbye to him at the hospital instead of losing him entirely on that back lawn, and I've never been sure whether that was meant as comfort or simply fact. But Ruth has thanked me for it, quietly, more than once in the years since, in a way that always makes me a little uncomfortable, because I never felt like I did anything except what any decent neighbor would have done. What Ruth didn't know, until much later, was that in the weeks after Hector's death, I quietly paid off the balance on the ambulance bill that their insurance hadn't fully covered, close to $4,000, by calling the billing office myself and settling it under my own name without ever telling her. I did the same the following year when her car needed a transmission replacement she couldn't quite afford on a nurse's pension alone, arranging with a mechanic I trusted to do the work and simply covering the difference, letting her believe her insurance had covered more of it than it actually had. I never mentioned either of these things to Ruth directly, the same way I imagine most people who quietly help their neighbors never mention it, because the help itself was never meant to be a transaction anybody kept score of. I want to be honest that I didn't do any of it expecting it to come back around someday in the form of a woman walking uninvited into my living room to check my incision site. I did it because Hector had mowed my lawn during Carol's illness without ever once being asked, and because that's simply what decent neighbors do for each other over the span of a long, ordinary friendship, one favor folding into the next without either side ever needing to keep a ledger. My own heart trouble started showing up on an EKG about 2 years ago, progressing slowly enough that my cardiologist and I both had time to plan the surgery carefully, rather than rushing into it as an emergency. When the surgery date was finally set, I called Melissa, and she immediately offered to fly in and stay for the recovery period, and I believed her completely. The same way I'd believed every promise she'd made me over the years, because believing your child's promises is a habit that doesn't wear out even after it's been tested more times than it probably should be. I told Ruth about the upcoming surgery about a month beforehand, mentioning it in passing over the fence one Saturday morning while we were both out doing yard work. "Frank, who's staying with you afterward?" "Melissa's flying in. She'll be here 2 weeks." Ruth nodded, and I noticed, though I didn't think much of it at the time, a small flicker of something crossing her face. The particular expression of a woman with 30 years of ICU experience who has seen more family promises evaporate under real-world pressure than most civilians ever witness in a lifetime. "Well," she said, "you know where I am if you need anything, regardless." The surgery itself went as well as these things go. I remember very little of the actual procedure, the way most people don't. But I remember waking up in the recovery unit with Melissa's hand over mine, her voice steady and reassuring, telling me everything had gone well, telling me she'd already told work she was staying 2 weeks, telling me I wasn't doing this alone. I believed her completely. I want to say that clearly, because it matters to what came next. There was no reason, at that moment, for me to doubt a single word of it. The first 4 days went reasonably well, considering. Melissa managed my medications, cooked simple meals, drove me to my first follow-up appointment, sat with me through the discomfort and disorientation that comes with a body relearning how to function after that kind of surgery. I remember thinking, during those 4 days, that whatever distance had grown between us over the previous 6 years was finally, genuinely closing, that this crisis, unlike Carol's death, might actually hold. On the 5th morning, everything changed in the span of about 15 minutes. I woke to find her already packed, already dressed for travel, already on the phone with someone from her office about a client presentation that had apparently been moved up unexpectedly. "Dad, I am so sorry. There's this whole situation at work. They moved up a client presentation, and if I'm not there Monday, it could seriously affect my position. I've set up your pill organizer for the week, I've stocked the fridge, and Mrs. Alvarez next door said she'd check on you. You're going to be fine." I want to note something here that I didn't fully register until much later, sitting with the memory for weeks afterward. Melissa's explanation implied Ruth had already agreed to check on me regularly, as though this had been discussed and arranged in advance. It hadn't. Melissa had mentioned it to Ruth in passing, the same kind of neighborly small talk anyone might make, and Ruth had said something polite, the way anyone would, and Melissa had apparently decided that polite exchange constituted an actual arrangement she could build her early departure around. "You're leaving today," I said, still groggy, still processing. "I have to, Dad. I'm sorry. This is huge for my career, and honestly, you're doing so much better than the doctors expected. I really think you'll be fine." I told her it was fine. I told her I understood. The Uber pulled into the driveway 10 minutes later, and she was gone, and I sat alone in my recliner, with an incision down the center of my chest, unable to reach a remote control 6 inches too far away, listening to a house go quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in 5 days. Ruth found me that afternoon, as I've already described, and what began as a single covered dish and a checked incision site turned, over the following days, into something considerably more sustained. She came by every morning to check my vitals and help me through the physical therapy exercises my surgeon had prescribed. She drove me to 2 follow-up appointments that week alone, sitting in the waiting room with a paperback novel, the same unhurried patience she must have carried through 30 years of ICU shifts. She noticed on the 3rd day that I was quietly rationing my pain medication because I was worried about running out before my next prescription refill, and she drove to the pharmacy herself to sort out the refill timing with my doctor's office, so I wouldn't have to manage that stress on top of everything else. I called Melissa on the 4th day of her absence, mostly just to hear her voice, and mentioned, in passing, that Ruth had been helping quite a bit. "Oh, good," Melissa said, sounding genuinely relieved, though something in her tone suggested relief less about my well-being specifically and more about her own conscience being eased. I knew she'd step up. She's such a sweet woman. I didn't correct the framing at the time, though something about it bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate yet. Ruth wasn't simply stepping up the way a friendly neighbor steps up to water your plants while you're on vacation. She was managing an actual medical recovery, the kind of care that typically requires either a trained professional or a deeply committed family member. And she was doing it because my actual family member had decided a client presentation mattered more. About 10 days into my recovery, I had a scare that made the full weight of the situation impossible to ignore any longer. I stood up too quickly one evening, reaching for something on a high shelf against every instruction my surgeon had given me, and felt a wave of dizziness strong enough that I lost my balance and went down hard against the kitchen counter, catching myself just enough to avoid a full fall, but jarring my healing sternum badly enough that pain shot through my whole chest. I called Ruth, not Melissa, because Ruth's number was the one I actually trusted to answer immediately at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. She was at my house within 4 minutes, having apparently sprinted across her own front lawn in house slippers, and she checked me over with the calm, methodical focus of 30 years of emergency medicine, determined I hadn't done any serious additional damage, but insisted on driving me to urgent care anyway, just to be certain, sitting with me for 3 hours in a waiting room, and then an exam room until a doctor confirmed nothing was seriously wrong. I called Melissa the next morning to tell her what had happened. There was a pause on the line long enough that I could hear her adjusting to the information. "Are you okay?" "God, I'm so sorry. I should have been there. Ruth got me to urgent care," I said. "I'm fine now." "Thank God for Ruth," Melissa said, and something about the easy relief in that sentence, the way it let her off the hook entirely without her seeming to notice she was being let off it, finally cracked something open in me that had been building quietly for 10 days. "Melissa," I said, "I need to ask you something honestly. When you left, was there actually an emergency at work, or was there something else going on?" Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, why are you asking me that?" "Because I've had a lot of quiet evenings alone in this house to think about it, and something about the timing has been bothering me." She was quiet for a long moment. "There wasn't a client emergency, not exactly," she finally admitted. "There was a work trip, a conference in San Diego, that I'd already committed to attending before your surgery was even scheduled. I didn't want to tell you I was leaving for a conference instead of staying with you, so I made it sound more urgent than it actually was." I sat with that for a long moment, the particular ache of learning that a small lie had shaped an entire week of my recovery. "You left me 5 days after open heart surgery to attend a marketing conference. When you say it like that, it sounds awful, Dad, but it's not like I abandoned you. I made sure Ruth would be checking in." "You mentioned it to her in passing, Melissa. You didn't arrange anything. She stepped in entirely on her own, because she happened to notice a car pulling out of my driveway 5 days after I came home from major surgery, and she has been managing my entire recovery essentially alone since then, while you've been at a conference telling yourself I was being looked after." The silence on the line stretched out long enough that I could hear her breathing change on the other end. "I didn't think about it that way," she finally said, quiet now. "I think you didn't want to think about it that way," I said, "because thinking about it clearly would have meant admitting you chose a conference over your father 5 days after open heart surgery." She didn't have a response for that, not right away, and we hung up not long after in a place that felt more unfinished than resolved. The weeks that followed my recovery deepened into something I hadn't expected. When Ruth first walked through my unlocked front door carrying a covered dish, she continued coming by daily, even after the most acute phase of my recovery passed, no longer out of medical necessity so much as out of a companionship that had developed almost without either of us fully noticing it happening. We started having dinner together most evenings, her cooking some nights, me managing simple meals on the nights my energy allowed for it. Two people who'd lost their spouses years apart finding, in the unlikeliest circumstances, a friendship that filled a space neither of us had quite realized was still empty. She told me things during those evenings I hadn't known before, about her 30 years in the ICU, about the specific weight of watching family members choose, again and again, whether to actually show up for the people they loved during the hardest moments of those people's lives. "You'd be amazed," she told me one evening, "how many people I watched die in that unit with a room full of relatives who'd flown in for the final 48 hours, after months of not visiting at all when the person actually needed them present. And you'd be amazed how many people got better, genuinely better, simply because someone showed up consistently through the boring, unglamorous middle of a recovery, when nobody's filming anything for social media and nobody's getting credit for anything." "Is that why you came over that first day?" I asked her. "Because you'd seen enough of the alternative?" "Partly," she admitted, "but mostly because Hector would have wanted me to, and because you never once made me feel like the help you gave us over the years was a transaction I owed you for. I never got the chance to properly repay Hector's debt to you, Frank. I got the chance to repay yours to us instead." I told her for the first time about the ambulance bill, about the transmission repair, two things I'd quietly settled years earlier without ever mentioning them. Ruth sat very still when I told her, her eyes wet. "I always wondered how that bill got resolved," she said softly. "I called the hospital about it once, years ago, and they told me it had already been settled through a payment arrangement, and I never found out who'd arranged it. It was you, this whole time. Hector mowed my lawn every week during Carol's illness without ever once being asked," I said. "I never considered either of those things a debt that needed announcing, just something a decent neighbor does for another one." Melissa called again about 3 weeks after our difficult conversation, her voice carrying a different weight than it had before. "Dad, can I come visit? Actually visit, not just for an emergency this time. I want to see you, and I think I owe you a real conversation, in person. She arrived the following weekend, and we sat together on my back porch, the same porch where Carol and I used to watch summer evenings turn to dusk for 30 years. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked out at the yard. "I've been sitting with something uncomfortable since our phone call," she finally said. "I keep replaying that morning I left, and I keep telling myself it was one bad decision, one conference I shouldn't have prioritized. But the more honestly I look at it, Dad, I think it's part of a much longer pattern. I've been treating your presence in my life like something that will always be there to reschedule around, the same way I rescheduled visits after Mom died, the same way holidays turned into phone calls instead of flights. This was just the starkest version of a habit I've had for years." I didn't say anything, just let her keep going, because I could tell she needed to reach the rest of it on her own. "And what makes it worse," she continued, her voice catching, "is that Ruth, who owes you nothing, who has her own grief, her own life, her own reasons to just mind her own business, showed up completely, immediately, without a single moment of hesitation for a neighbor. And your own daughter needed a phone call calling her out on a lie before she could even see clearly what she'd actually done." "I appreciated you saying that," I told her quietly. "But Melissa, I need you to understand something too. I'm not looking to punish you for this, or hold it over you forever. I'm looking for you to actually understand it clearly, so that the next crisis, whenever it comes, looks different than this one did." "I want it to look different," she said. "I don't expect you to just trust that overnight, but I want the chance to actually earn it back." She met Ruth properly that weekend, not in passing over a fence the way they'd known each other superficially for years, but as two women who now shared something significant in common. "I owe you an apology too," Melissa told her. "You did what I should have been doing, and you did it without a single complaint for weeks." Ruth, characteristically gracious, waved off some of the weight of that. "I did what anyone with medical training and a decent heart would do for a neighbor in that position. But I'll be honest, Melissa, your father talks about you constantly, even during the hardest weeks. He never once said a harsh word about you leaving. I think you should know that, whatever else you're working through." That conversation seemed to land on Melissa harder than almost anything else that weekend. Understanding that even in his most vulnerable moments, I'd never used her absence as a weapon against her, and that the gentleness of that restraint had somehow made the reality of her absence even clearer to her than anger ever could have. The following months brought changes I hadn't fully anticipated when Ruth first walked through my unlocked door. Melissa started calling every few days instead of every few weeks, genuine calls, not check-the-box calls, asking real questions about my physical therapy progress, about my diet restrictions, about how Ruth and I were doing. She flew in for an entire week during a stretch when nothing medically urgent was even happening, simply to be present, to help around the house, to sit with me and Ruth over dinners that had by then become a near-nightly ritual between the two of us. "I want to actually know this version of your life," she told me during that visit. "Not just the version I check in on during emergencies." Ruth and I, for our part, found our friendship deepening into something neither of us had expected, but both of us, I think, had quietly been hoping for, without admitting it even to ourselves. We started taking walks together most evenings, once my physical therapy cleared me for longer distances, sitting on one or the other of our porches most weekend afternoons, sharing the particular companionship of two people who understand loss deeply enough not to need to explain it to each other. About 8 months after my surgery, at my cardiologist's request, I organized a small gathering at my house to thank everyone who'd helped through my recovery, my physical therapist, a few neighbors who'd pitched in with small errands here and there, and of course Ruth, whose contribution dwarfed everyone else's combined. Melissa flew in for it and stood up partway through the evening with a glass raised, the mirror image, in some ways, of a toast I'd once worried might never come from her at all. "I want to say something," she said, and the room quieted. 8 months ago, I left my father 5 days after open-heart surgery to attend a work conference, and I told myself a small lie to make that decision feel more acceptable than it actually was. In the time since, I've learned an enormous amount about what actually showing up for someone looks like, mostly by watching a woman who owed my father. Nothing demonstrated more completely than his own daughter did. "Ruth, I don't think I can ever fully repay what you did for my dad during those weeks, but I want you to know I see it clearly now, and I'm grateful for it every single day. Ruth, uncharacteristically emotional in front of a room, simply nodded and raised her own glass in return. Later that year, working with my own attorney, I made a decision I want to be honest about because I think it matters to how this story actually ends. I amended my estate plan to include a provision for Ruth, not as a replacement for anything Melissa would inherit, but as a formal acknowledgement of a debt that had grown considerably larger and considerably more personal than the quiet favors I'd extended to her family years before Hector's death. I told Melissa about this decision directly, in person, well before finalizing anything, a lesson I'd learned, ironically, from a story a friend once told me about a very different kind of family surprise that had gone badly precisely because it wasn't shared honestly in advance. "I think that's exactly right, Dad," Melissa said when I explained it to her. "She's earned every bit of that, and honestly, so has our whole family, in a way none of us could have predicted 8 months ago." Last month, Ruth and I hosted a small neighborhood get-together in my backyard, the same yard where Hector used to trim hedges every Saturday morning, the same yard I nearly fell in reaching for a shelf I shouldn't have been reaching for. Melissa came in from Phoenix for it, helping Ruth set up tables, laughing about something in the kitchen the way I once imagined. Hopefully, a whole family might someday laugh together again. I sat on my porch that evening, watching my daughter and the woman who'd quite literally helped save both my recovery and my understanding of what family actually means, talking easily together near the grill, and I understood something I don't think I'd have understood as clearly without that lonely, difficult fifth morning forcing all of it into the open. Family was never really about who shares your last name or your blood. It was about who actually shows up, consistently, in the unglamorous middle of a hard recovery when nobody's filming anything and nobody's getting credit for it. Ruth taught me that lesson without ever once intending to teach anyone anything. Melissa is still learning it, later than either of us might have liked, but learning it fully now, in a way that means more to me than any single visit or any single promise ever could. If this story reminded you of someone who's quietly shown up for you when it mattered most, without ever asking for recognition, or someone in your own life you've let down without fully realizing the weight of it, maybe it's worth having the honest conversation today, rather than waiting for a recovery, a crisis, or an empty house to force it into the open. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more true stories about family, recovery, and the people who show up when it actually counts.